first panel we just had, which I hope you find it as interesting as I had, so that we can have now a common understanding of what we mean by water and sustainable development. I mean, we still will have to read quite a lot, I can see that, before we can get a common understanding, but that was the purpose. And I think it was also very interesting to know what is this roadmap, this complex roadmap ahead of us. I'm not sure how you felt about the discussion that was presented by Karen Lexen, but I thought it was fascinating to see what is happening behind the scenes. What are the forces there? What are the agreements? How people are juggling with language to make sure that everybody agrees. And also, I think very interesting to know that we are not here just with these water processes, that there are things happening out there in the UN system as well that are really very informative for the kind of issues that we need to deal with. I have kept in my memory some of the key dates that may be linked to the discussions we have here today. I have heard Joachim, from the 18th to the 22nd of May, we will have a meeting on the means of implementation. So basically, this meeting will, hopefully, we will also get some inputs into that. I also have written down the July conference on financing in Addis Ababa. We are also talking about financing here. So let's try to make sure that works. And I would also like to thank Karen for their encouragement on the issues of how useful the efforts you are all making here about producing this toolbox to really be an input into the process. Okay, so now we are going to have, as you can see, a very impressive panel here. So all these people, they are all here for you. And they're all here also for the over 1,000 people that normally watch us by a webcast. So hopefully we have a wider impact. The discussion openers we have here today are intended to provide information about what we already know, what is our common knowledge in the UN system and our partners, in relation to the tools for implementation. So all these toolboxes that we have been talking about, all the tools you have, so what do we know? What is out there that is already, a lot of work has been done before this conference, of course. So the intentions of this discussion openers is to serve to highlight some of the issues that you will be discussing tomorrow, because you all here have a role tomorrow in the different parallel sessions. So that in a way, and that's what I encourage my speakers to do, it is your messages to them on what you want them to discuss, because these same people will take back what you have been saying the last day and will reflect back on how maybe they have changed their mind or not in relation to their initial presentations. So you may also want to use these presentations to propose some of the possible lessons learned that you also like to see, so that it gives an idea of how the discussions we will have tomorrow will have an impact on what we know. So we'll know more at the end of the day. You have 15 minutes each. I know you have time. And in a way, these presentations now, they are more conventional. Tomorrow it is more about debate and dialogue. This first day is more about conventional putting forward information to you. So you have to, I really apologize of that. As soon as we had a debate, you can see it before in the panel before, it was most interesting. But I think it's important to have the information, that common information on the table. So tomorrow we don't go over and over again on what we already know, that we really have a dialogue. And after that, we are going to have a response panel from the thematic perspective. So we have 4 panelists on the tools and 4 panelists on the thematic perspective. So now we are going to start after I have explained what we are doing here. And I would like to ask Jose Hesti from UNICEF to talk about implementing the WASH-related targets through capacity development and social instruments and the role of the different stakeholders.
That's a lot.
Just give us food for thought.
Yes, I will. Okay, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon. Thanks, Josefina. Thanks very much for inviting us in UNICEF to make this presentation. We believe that this shows that we seem to know about what we talk when we talk about water sanitation and hygiene. I will also ask you to excuse my voice. It's a little bit, I'm having a cold, so I'm having some problems with my voice. The way we have structured this presentation is first to talk a little bit about the implementation baseline for WAS, and we have already heard a couple of thoughts about this, but I will explain a little bit in more detail on where are we now with the implementation of the water sanitation MDGs, and where are we looking and how does this look as a baseline for the SDGs. We will also make the core of the presentation around what is already working, what we think in UNICEF and together with other partners in the sector think are already the tools that are making progress and helping us advance. And then I will make just one slide very quickly, if I have time, to spice a little bit the conversations tomorrow about the different roles of the different stakeholders. So we have already heard today that thanks to the joint monitoring program that, as you know, is led by UNICEF and WHO, and has provided us with a lot of information about numerical information on where we how are we doing with the progress of the implementation of the MDGs. We know that in 2010 the world globally achieved the water MDG, which is very good news. But we also know, and therefore I wanted to present you with this map, that Sub-Saharan Africa is really facing the greatest challenge when it comes to provision of drinking water. Indeed, as you can see on the screen, there are a couple of countries where access to improved water sources is not even reaching 50% of the population. And although the water MDG was globally met, this shows the huge disparities in access. If we look at the same thing, but just paying attention to what is the progress that different countries are making towards the achievement of their national kind of MDG targets, we see that there are a lot of countries pictured in orange, meaning that they are not on track to meet the water target. If we look at the situation with the progress on sanitation, this is even much worse, because here is not just about problems in Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's more worldwide. We can see that there are a lot of countries where access to improved sanitation is not reaching even 50% of the population. When it comes to the progress towards the achievement of the MDGs, it looks even worse, with a lot of countries colored in orange, meaning that they are not on track. And here, I'm very much working in UNICEF as a water specialist, so I've been also advised to bring some key highlights by my sanitation colleagues. And here they asked me to say, and to remind you that, or if you don't know, that a huge challenge for the sanitation agenda is still that we have more than 1 billion people still defecating in the open. And they have also asked me to communicate to you that 2/3 of this population are still living in middle-income countries. And this is all to say that if we are talking about open defecation in middle-income countries, it's really clear to us that economic development is not really working at the same speed as social development, right? And highlighting the issue of inequalities. But I also have my personal slide to talk about inequalities, and I really like this slide very much because I think it talks very well about when we talk about the water MDG being globally met, and then the disparities between, we've seen the disparities between a lot of countries not being on track, but also here we can see that global averages mask a lot of things. Because if we look at the map in the middle, we see a couple of countries in red, showing that 50% of the population, they don't have access to drinking water sources. But if we take a look to what happened in urban areas, we see that the map looks much better. We don't see any red, we see a lot of blue, meaning that the access is much better. But if we take a look on the right, and we see the rural areas, we see that for the same countries, there are a lot of areas, rural areas, that are not really having even 50% of the population with access to improved water sanitation and hygiene. So basically, in this part of the presentation, we've been talking about access to water and sanitation, and we have already highlighted a couple of issues about inequalities. But as we have already heard during the first session, they're having already a lot of consultations and a lot of dialogues and a lot of reports already with our colleagues trying to identify what is the best thing, the best way forward for a new agenda, for an SDG agenda. And then I just wanted to highlight here a couple of issues that we see as main challenges for the WAS sector as we are going to jump into the implementation of the new development agenda beyond 2015. The first of them is the issue about financing, which has been already mentioned here. And then, as has been mentioned in the WHO and UN Water report, 2015, the GLASS report, there is a huge need to secure, absorb, and target sustain international and national financing. There are good news because we know that between 2012 and 2014, international commitments for water and sanitation have increased as much as by 30%. But this may not be enough if what we are going to achieve or we want to achieve is universal access. As we have already seen in the previous slide, we will need to strengthen the efforts to reach rural areas. The third point is about sustainability, which has been a recurrent challenge during the implementation of the MDGs and will continue being a strong implementing challenging for us. We know that anytime now in sub-Saharan Africa, 30 up to 40% of the hand pumps are not functional. We will need to renew, as we've been already reminded by the consultations on the thematic consultations, that WAS need to be taken forward beyond households and need to reach institutions like health centers and schools. And finally, there's been this forgotten issue about hygiene. I mean, hygiene H has been the last part of the WAS acronym, and it's been very much forgotten. We will see now a couple of reflections on how to implement the agenda, paying attention to hygiene as well. So as I said at the beginning, now the core part of the presentation, as Josefina has asked us as well, apart from making a quick overview and saying a little bit what is the baseline, is to talk about what do we think are the main tools or the main approaches that are really helping us in the WAS sector to take the MDG agenda forward, and we believe therefore will also help us taking the SDG agenda forward. And now I'm already getting a warning. So first of all, it's going to be, I would like to talk about something that has been mentioned already several times, which is the implementation of the human rights to water and sanitation. It's been already said that in 2010, water and sanitation were already recognized as human rights. And since then, we've been working, we have tried to collaborate with the Special Rapporteur, with Katerina Albuquerque, and we hope to do the same with Leo. Which we welcome very much. Just to say that Katerina has been requested by states and by many international organizations and different stakeholders to try to provide a little bit more guidance on what does it really mean, the implementation of the water and sanitation rights. So at the end of her mandate, she has written together with her team this very interesting tool which really provides practical guidance and checklists on how to do that, how to make water and sanitation a reality. We've been talking, and I have mentioned as the first challenge, the securing of financing. And here an approach or an instrument that we have is the existing Sanitation and Water for All partnership, which is a partnership that comprises 90 developing countries, donors, civil society, and others, and is really paying attention to try to catalyze funding for the sector. Apart from that, the SWA, the Sanitation and Water for All partnership, really provides a framework for increasing the sector coordination and visibility of the sector, and also to capacitate governments and countries for stronger systems and institutions. A key issue that I have already mentioned, which is sustainability of water and sanitation services, is something that our donors and ourselves in UNICEF, we are very much concerned, and we know that it's a real challenge for the sector. And here is the approach that we are trying to show to the sector, because we think it's working, which is kind of a stepwise approach to sustainability that starts with a thorough analysis of what are the main bottlenecks for sustainability in the sector. And there are different tools that can be used. We are using one which is called the WAS Bottleneck Analysis tool, but there are other tools in the sector that can be used. What we are doing is we are signing compacts with host governments, basically to agree on what are the roles and responsibilities, not just as the international community supporting WAS sector, but also what are the roles and responsibilities of the government when supporting sustainability in the sector. And this is finally checked with what we call the sustainability checks, etc. We have seen that during the implementation of the MDG agenda, and also we are very happy that the MDG target has been met for water, millions of new water points will have to be developed during the implementation of the new agenda. And then we have learned already a lot of things from what has happened during the last 15 years. We know that we know that groundwater is the most reliable source to provide water in rural sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore we are very much interested in developing what you can see on the screen, which is a code of practice for the development of cost-effective boreholes. This is a tool that outlines key principles on how to work on a cost-effective way with water provision, and it's been very useful for some governments to set their own standards, as you can see on the screen, and I believe this will be discussed tomorrow with the Nigerian colleagues from the government in setting their own standards. In order to reach those, because we know that although we have met the water NDG, we know that the latest estimate is around 748 million people not having access to water. And who are these people? Who are these 748 million people? They are the most difficult to reach. They are the most living in areas where it's most difficult to reach, and it's not, in many cases, not cost effective. In UNICEF, together with other partners, we have developed this toolkit for the professionalization of the manual drilling sector, knowing that manual drilling can provide the same quality of water and is 4 to 10 times cheaper than regular drilling programs. And with this tool, we have helped some governments to assess their own markets and capacitate local entrepreneurs, ultimately leading to sustainable results. About the issue of sanitation, the leading approach that we are following together with all the partners in the sector is what you may know, it's called the community-led total sanitation approaches to end open defecation. Probably you are familiar with this approach, which is ultimately trying to change the behavior of communities that are defecating in the open. So it's basically to make them aware that by defecating in the open, they are contaminating their own water sources, and therefore they are compromising their health. I will, yes. Just 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Just give me 2 minutes. Just to couple and to match the community total approaches to sanitation, it's also we are working with sanitation marketing approaches, basically to reinforce demand and also help expanding the supply. Recurrent issues, as we've seen with the water agenda, is to reach the poorest and more marginalized households. In terms of water safety, I won't expand so much because I'm very happy to know that I have WHO colleagues coming after to reinforce some of the tools around water quality. Importantly, the implementation of water safety planning. And I didn't want to just finish without mentioning the hygiene, which is, I think it's very important. We are aware about the issues, important challenges in sustaining hygiene behaviors. And we are trying to learn from other sectors. To support the hygiene programs, what we have tried to do recently is the development of this tool, which helps with the monitoring and evaluation of hygiene programs. We also, very quickly, I'm about to finish, just when it comes to washing institutions, there are already tools available, tools on what are the best approaches to reach the highest amount of schools in a country, with the approach that we call the 3-star school approach, which is something similar to the 5-star hotel, but with 3-star schools. And then also when it comes to health centers, the discussion is very much now ongoing, but there are already some tools or some documents that we can really look at for the basis of what are the minimum standards in terms of water quantity and water quality and sanitation in health centers. Also, there are tools available for climate change resilience, and then the roles of the different stakeholders, which will be very much discussed tomorrow. Just let me just say one sentence about each of them. Obviously, the governments, and we expect to hear about this tomorrow, will need to be driving during the implementation of the SDGs in the driving seat. They will have to continue protecting public interest and regulating the business through policy development, regulation, and facilitation. We expect from business, of course, as they are very much engaged, to take a new role, emphasizing their respect for human rights and also embracing corporate, social, and environmental responsibility. From civil society is very much, we are very much learning about the new communication tools and tools for participation. So it is expected that civil society, of course, will have to play a very powerful role in the implementation of the SDGs as an enabler and as a constructive challenger. Finally, the academia, which obviously is going to continue being the driver for technological innovation and also for evidence-based when it comes to policy making.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Sorry for rushing you, but we have to keep time. We have a tight agenda. And there is a lot out there, as you can see already, and I think already some challenges for the different stakeholder groups for your discussions tomorrow about your roles. So, please, Aziza Ahmud from the OECD, she's going to talk about governance and challenges, implementation tools. She's been working on this project for a long time. So.
Thank you very much, Josefina. Let me start by thanking you and your team for the great work in putting together all these people and inviting us to contribute to shaping some of the discussion that we'll be having on governance over the next 2 days. I have a few slides, 6 or 7 slides that should, yeah, they're coming? Okay. Well, we can do without slides, huh? So it's a very interesting discussion, actually, and I'd like to insist a bit on that, because the very rationale for the OECD to start working on water governance, and that started basically 5 years ago, was precisely because many of our member countries were coming back to us arguing that many of the solutions to the water crisis were basically known, and that there were a lot of toolkits, a lot of guidance, a lot of instruments that have been basically used within and across the countries, but that the main bottleneck, I would say, to make them happen on the ground had to do with governance. And this is where the organization was called upon basically to try to see to what extent the different messages that were sent to governments on governance were applying to the water sector. So the rationale basically for the session and that we tried to put on the paper in terms of how we can shape the discussions was to say that after reviewing 17 OECD countries, 13 Latin American countries, roughly 4 or 5 countries in the MENA region, we have taken some lessons in terms of what is preventing today sustainable water management from a governance point of view that we think echo very much some of the barriers and obstacles that we can anticipate from a governance point of view in terms of making a water SDG happen on the ground. These obstacles have been clustered into 7 main gaps that we call multi-level governance gap that are also very much at the core of some of the intrinsic characteristics of the water sector itself, and that makes it different from other policy areas, not only because it is both a global and a local good, but also because it seems, and it is in many fronts, maybe more fragmented than other policy areas, because it has externalities and spillovers on many other domains, because it is a factor for growth and economic development. And so these gaps are really gaps that we have identified in all countries, regardless of their institutional setting and regardless of their hydrological availability. They may be more or less acute, more or less relevant, but they're appearing all over the place. And they range from issues related to the administrative gap, which is this typical mismatch that we have between administrative boundaries, whether they're municipalities, whether they're provinces, national boundaries, but also hydrological perimeters. And in all the countries, they barely coincide. And that raises typically the question at which territorial scale is water to be managed, and how the basin governance systems that are in place can integrate other water-relevant territories depending on the water function at stake. It has also huge information asymmetries between the different authorities, between the different responsible stakeholders. It has also, from the experience we've seen, quite a divide between data on meteorological information and hydrological information that has very much improved in the past 15 years and also very much in the process of the MDG, but still a lot to be done, including in OECD countries in terms of of economic and financial data, for example. Tracking today who is paying for what when it comes to water management remains a significant challenge. Issues of capacities that were developed right now, I'd like to insist very much on the capacity of public administrations also to follow a new culture in decision making, to have a different approach to policy making, stakeholders engagement, and that is something that goes much beyond the technical capacity, the knowledge of the sector, or even, I would say, the hard capacity of the infrastructure itself. Funding gap, we've been observing that in many countries, decentralization has taken place without necessarily decentralization of financial resources that allow the different institutions to deliver, and that is something that is to be mapped and understood and also addressed. Accountability gap in terms of integrity, in terms of transparency, in terms of stakeholder engagement. And one of the gaps that we see very often, and I see a parallel with the way the architecture of SDGs is being thought, which is what we call this policy gap with the temptation of silos, I would say, between water-related policy areas that we see very often playing or having a contradictory impact on the sector itself. I mean, you can have big, bold ambitions to reform the water sector, to achieve a dedicated water SDG, if you're having counter incentives in other areas like energy or agriculture, other harmful subsidies that may be justified for other reasons, that is definitely playing against water itself. So there is quite a systemic, interactive, and mutually dependence between the different goals that echoes also the discussion on whether there should be a dedicated water goal or whether water is everywhere basically in the SDGs. And even if there is a dedicated water goal, which seems to be the way forward and that contributes, I think, to raise the profile in the agenda, that does not preclude that you still need strong synergies, coordination and interactions with related domains. So we have basically in the background issues paper, I won't insist too much, but trickled this down into the four main topics that will be discussed over the coming day or two in the conference, to give some concrete examples of how some of these gaps can basically hinder some of the targets that are considered right now in the current architecture of the SDG. When it comes to drinking water and sanitation, of course, what comes first, as I said, is the issue of capacity. We see more and more utilities operating in the red, and that is, of course, an issue, but also inadequate funding. And there, I'd like to say something. This is not only an issue for developing countries. The issue of how you're going to renew, maintain your infrastructure is an increasing issue for OECD countries as well, that have financed their infrastructure and their other sources of funding, heavily relying on public finance, in most cases 150 years of taxes, and that today are, for many of them, in situations of crisis, fiscal consolidation and so on, and need to think of different innovative mechanisms to renew the infrastructure in a context where we see a lot of leakages and some collapsing networks in big cities of the OECD region. So that is not something that is only to be borne to the attention of developing countries that have to put infrastructure in place. Renewing assets is also a challenge for countries that already have universal coverage in place. Water resources management, issues of scale, as I said, and more discussions about the effectiveness of basin governance institutions and what are the framework conditions to make sure that they're actually delivering in terms of what the expected outcomes are. We see a lot of countries where these organizations have been created without necessarily the operational and the policy frameworks that can back up their activities. Water quality and wastewater treatment, with a lot of discussions going around the sectoral fragmentation that can hinder pollution prevention, recycling and reuse, the limited enforcement of water quality targets, the lack of accountability and transparency when it comes to complying with these standards for water quality and wastewater treatment. Risk management for disasters, a big issue around information that was at the very core of a recommendation that the OECD had last year on the governance of critical risks, how to produce and share the information on meteorological, hydrological data, knowing that there is a scientific uncertainty that also has to be acknowledged, and this lack of common framework for safety measures and level of risk that in some countries that are not covered by supranational or international arrangements can be an issue. We have, from these lessons, and that can maybe also guide the discussion in the coming 2 days, tried to identify what are the 12 must-have that should be in place for clear public policies that can support the implementation of a water-related sustainable development goal. And these have to do with the effectiveness of water governance, they have to do with the efficiency of water governance, and they have to do with the engagement and trust in water governance. Now, having these 12 building blocks in place doesn't mean that the water SDG will be achieved on time, but missing one of these may actually raise issues in terms of implementation. There is on top of that, of course, a dimension related to the political economy of reform that has to be taken into account. So this is work that is very much in process. That will translate into a guidance to OECD and other adhering countries in the coming 6 months, and that will basically create, I would say, a moral force to commit governments to improve their institutional and regulatory frameworks in the water sector. So they range, as you can see, from issues related to the allocation of roles and responsibilities, the scale, policy coherence, capacity, policy-relevant data and information, financial resources, regulatory frameworks, innovation, which is very important. We observe a lot of not only path dependency in the sector, but also some situations where regulatory and governance frameworks are not always conducive to innovation. And when I talk about innovation, it's both technical and non-technical innovation, and this is something that, that can be and should be addressed. And of course, issues of integrity, transparency, equity between places, people, but also categories of users. There are here also a few newcomers that probably deserve a bit of attention because they're generating future liabilities for water management without necessarily bearing related costs. We see that, for example, in terms of property developers, and there's some guidance that is ongoing to make sure that equity is also ensured in that regards. So how to get there? This is basically what the conference is discussing. I have two more slides left. We have produced an inventory that includes 150 governance tools, guidelines, clustered around each of these 12 building blocks. Some of these tools, in terms of risk management and so on, are going to be presented in the coming day or two. And this is meant to be something to be lively updated. So this is really something that is available online and can be accessed to anyone that wants to know what is being said or what is being advocated in terms of governance when it comes to water quality management, when it comes to the performance of service providers, and so on. In addition to that, there's maybe a last point I want to make, because there was a very good linkage earlier made to the indicator system that should come after the SDG. And I think the discussion we'll be having over the coming day or two in terms of the good practices that exist on the ground that have been pilot tested and that can contribute to the implementation of an SDG also need to be checked, I would say, against their ability to be replicated. And that implies thinking of a set of indicators that can help doing this. And I know a lot of the discussions on which targets should be within a water dedicated goal pointed out the fact that when it comes to governance, it becomes much more difficult to measure. And maybe by definition, we excluded some areas because they had to do with sovereignty or they had to do with political dimensions that we think can't be measured. Well, we argue that we can measure. We can measure from a fact-based point of view. We can measure from a perception-based point of view. view. And there's significant work that is ongoing to identify the proxies, to build on the huge amount of work that has also been done by UN Water, and that can help make this cycle positive between the analysis, the identification of what the challenges are, and the learning curve to improve. So these water governance indicators that are under preparation go in parallel to the development of the principles that I mentioned earlier. This is my last slide, just to say that we flagged a few roles, of course, for the different stakeholders that will be basically identified also during this conference in the parallel sessions, not only for government, civil society, business, and academia. And I think the last session on Saturday is probably the most important, because this is the one that brings back together the silos, even if we need silos within each of the communities, and helps draw lessons from what can collegially or collectively be done to improve water governance. So this is all for me. I would really like to thank in advance all those that will be rapporteurs on governance in the different sessions, and I look forward to the technical discussions tomorrow and to the wrap-up on Saturday.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing some hope about this ability to be able to report and monitor on governance. And I think that's something that all of us are always thinking that it would be very difficult. So now I'd like to invite Hannah Leckie from OECD. She's going to talk about financing and economic instruments.
Buenos tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here at the UN Water Conference here in Zaragoza, and thank you, Josefina. A distinctive feature of the work we do at the OECD is the promotion of the economic and financing dimensions of water policies. Today is about setting the scene for the next couple of days, when we will discuss in more detail the financing and economic instruments and tools for implementing the SDG on water. In this presentation, we will look at new evidence which demonstrates water security as a driver for growth and highlight the value of economic instruments to achieve the SDG on water. Lastly, I will focus on implementation issues and economic tools for water pricing and financing water resource management. An expert task force commissioned by the OECD and the Global Water Partnership have recently confirmed that water security is a statistically significant causal factor in economic growth. The key factor related to economic growth is hydrological variability, or the variability of runoff. And this trend affects all countries, not just those whose economy is reliant on agriculture. Enhancing water security matters for achieving the SDG on water and involves managing 4 key risks. Too little water, particularly in the BRICS countries, parts of Africa and the US. Too much water, people at risk are heavily weighted in Asia, and assets at risk are heavily weighted in OECD and Asia. Poor water quality risks, particularly in emerging economies such as India, China and Africa. And finally, risks to ecosystems and the services they provide. These risks to water security can increase the risk of inadequate access to safe water supply and sanitation, and undermine the achievement of other SDGs on poverty alleviation, food and energy security, and gender equality. Many regions and countries face several of these risks, and climate change and population growth are exacerbating them. For example, the OECD Environmental Outlook projects that by 2050, global water demand would have increased by 55%. At the same time, the value of assets at risk are increasing. This graph plots the world's largest river basins, represented by the circles. The colours represent GDP. The vertical axis shows increasing investment in water security, and the horizontal axis increasing variability in runoff. The graph is essentially showing that river basins colour-coded green have low variability in runoff and high investment in water security have high incomes. In contrast, where there's been low investment to cope with complex hydrology, economic output is overwhelmingly low, such as basins in Africa and India, shown in the colour red. Investments in institutions, infrastructure, efficiency and allocation mechanisms can shift river basins and countries upward in the chart, reflecting improved water security. But at the same time, climate change may shift them rightward, increasing hydrological variability and water risks. A key question remaining is how we pay to build, operate and maintain, and in many countries rebuild, the water infrastructures and institutions needed to underpin economic growth for the future. And how can economic instruments help? There are a number of economic instruments that can assist with improving and financing water security. Trading mechanisms are effective for reallocating water to the highest value use. There are also new cases of water quality trading emerging in New Zealand, Canada and the US. Non-market instruments can also help compensate for negative externalities. These include abstraction and pollution charges. Water pricing increases revenue and encourages water conservation. Payment for ecosystem services is a voluntary payment, usually by downstream users to upstream farmers, for practices that reduce pollution or increase water availability. Successful case studies include the Fund for Protection of Water in Quito, Ecuador, and lowering nitrate levels in water supplies in the UK. Another form of payment for ecosystem services includes certification or eco-labelling schemes. Here, the costs of water, services and externalities are included in the price paid for a product. Lastly, insurance premiums in principle reflect water risks, generate revenues to compensate potential losses, and can drive behavioural choices. For example, decentivising people to build in high-risk areas such as floodplains, or requiring certain standards such as houses to be built on stilts. There have been discussions in France and the Netherlands on the pros and cons of insurance to manage flood risks. In summary, economic instruments can raise revenues, promote efficient uses, allocate water where it creates more value, provide incentives to explore low-cost options, and engage stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement can also help determine the appropriate level of water security and the willingness to pay for it. But this does not always happen in reality. There are implementation problems. If we think about water pricing and tariffs, we know that tariffs are the most effective and reliable source of funding for operation maintenance and refurbishment of water infrastructure. But in practice, case studies confirm that in many countries, the water supply and sanitation sector fails to access the funds required to achieve policy objectives. For example, the MGG on sanitation will not be met, in part because the water sector fails to attract public and private funds that are essential to ensure increased access to sanitation services. Governments rely on taxes which do not cover investment needs, particularly given recent fiscal consolidation due to the financial crisis and public debt of many countries. If we look at these two graphs, we can clearly see that in OECD countries, raising water tariffs is not a matter of affordability, but an issue of willingness to charge. Whilst this has not been a problem in the past, increasingly slow, water infrastructure is reaching or is past the end of its design life, requiring huge capital investment for replacement of inefficient aging infrastructure, which increases exposure to water risks. The graph on the left shows the variability of water prices in OECD countries, a reflection of the political will to charge. If we look at Italy and Denmark as an example, they have roughly the same operating costs, but Denmark charge 4 times for water than that of Italy, meaning that Denmark are achieving full cost recovery of externalities, and Italy are putting off investment and upgrades for tomorrow. The graph on the right shows that the level of disposable income spent on water by the lowest decile households is less than the 3 to 5% threshold recommended. We can afford to raise tariffs. The OECD has been using tools to support better use of tariffs. Benchmarking allows comparison of water prices amongst countries and shows trends over time. It can help stimulate change by identifying when tariffs need to be increased. The graph I have just shown is an illustration of this. The 3 T's, tariffs, taxes, and transfers, are the ultimate sources of funding. The 3 T's is a tool to help countries realise that these sources are the only true sources of financing available. Bank loans and private sector investments must be paid back through a combination of the 3 T's. The OECD has used this tool extensively to explain this to countries, in particular the former Soviet Union. Okay. Strategic environmental planning anticipates future financing needs, considering operation and maintenance and replacement costs, and matches policy ambitions with financial resources. Performance-based contracts between municipalities and water utilities can incentivise better performance for the same price. They can be set to increase connections to water supply and sanitation, increase revenue collection, and to decrease non-revenue water. Private sector participation for water supply and sanitation can assist in bridging the financial investment gap. The development of a sustainable business model is required to assess the combination of the 3 T's in order to first attract and then pay back investors. Financing for water resource management is required to invest in and operate infrastructures and to operate institutions that facilitate them. However, the sector remains largely underfunded due to low irrigation prices, increasing infrastructure needs, and the need for adaptation to climate change, degradation of water quality, ecosystems and ecosystem services, and many other reasons. There are a number of tools that can be used to bridge the financing gap. The OECD has developed 4 principles as a framework to help governments ensure adequate financing is available to effectively manage resources. The polluter pays principle creates conditions to make pollution a costly activity, to alleviate pollution and to compensate for welfare loss. The beneficiary pays principle allows sharing of the financial burden across public and private actors. Equity addresses affordability or competitive issues, such as when water bills are disproportionate with users' capacity to pay. Coherence between policies that affect water resources, such as agriculture, land use, and energy, is essential to ensure that policies are mutually supportive and do not work against each other. However, potential tensions between these principles need to be managed. For example, the polluter and beneficiary pays principles can be conflicting. The OECD has developed guidance on payment for ecosystem services to minimise the conflict between these principles. Inconsistency across sectors and policy objectives can generate undue costs. For example, subsidised energy to farmers in India and Mexico has induced high groundwater abstraction for irrigation and significant lowering of groundwater levels. Identification and then reform of environmentally harmful subsidies is usually a win-win situation, which can save money and improve environmental conditions, an attractive tool that can be used to engage with ministries and treasury. The OECD has reviewed harmful subsidies in Russia and Kazakhstan, and more efforts are required to develop a method to systematically track subsidies in our member countries and beyond. The key messages I'd like to leave with you today are: we know that economic instruments will be essential for achieving the SDG on water. There are some implementation issues, but there are tools that can be used to overcome them. Robust economic analysis is required for all economic instruments and tools to document costs and revenue and to establish facts to move policy reform further. I look forward to our fruitful discussions in the next 2 days, learning from your experience from civil society, government, business and academia. And I'll see you again on Saturday for the wrap-up session when I hope we can address some of these implementation issues. Gracias, thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. So you see that we gave a very hard task to our speakers of bringing together quite a lot of their knowledge, and I think Hannah has raised some, issues that will be polemic. To say the least, is the issues of we can increase tariffs, and we also have harmful subsidies. Maybe the speakers here, the people in the panels can deal with that in the different sessions. Okay, now we have Elisa Tonda. So Elisa has been in our conferences before, so she knows what we are doing here. And she's going to talk about technology challenges and tools. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon to everybody. Yes, I've been to one conference. Does this make me part of the family already? Yes, yes. Okay, great. So what we try to do with this presentation, and I need to say up front that I'm sharing the merit of everything I'm presenting to you with my colleague Christian Susan from UNIDO, who is sitting back there and will be more involved in the Saturday session, is to try and somehow summarize some of the outcomes of the research which is reflected in the background paper. I'll promise you I will not go into the details of a 15 or 17-page document. I'll just give you some highlights that might inspire the discussion in the coming days. And I'm not sure if that will be so much welcome. I'll also share some insight in another process, yes, yet another process, that is related to means of implementation and especially technology that is ongoing within the UN system. That again might be an opportunity to come up with a consolidated view and a unique voice that is informing also this process. So I will actually start by tracking back some of the history that relates to technology and it being a means of implementation more formally as of the Rio+20 conference. I'll share with you some of the developments of that discussion and what it will lead on to. And after that, I will be tracking some elements of the landscape that we identified within the background paper, both in terms of technology gaps and in terms of technology challenges or opportunities, whatever we want to call them. And leading out from that, I will somehow leave some homeworks, as the homeworks have been done so far by us in preparing the background paper. Now there's homeworks also for the discussions of the coming days into trying and identify some replies to the question that were coming out really loud and clear from the analysis of the documents that we carried out in preparation of this background document. As I was indicating to you, technology is clearly recognized in the Rio+20 outcome document as one of the key means of implementation, and this has brought to the development of a number of discussions at the level of General Assembly that were sparked by two complementary reports, that of the UN Secretary General. Full details are here and in the background document, and a series of 8 workshops and structured dialogue during the 67th and 68th session of General Assembly. As you have all seen, these discussions have been permeating as well in the report of the open-ended working group in terms of technology being reflected within Goal 17 that is specifically touching upon means of implementation, but you clearly see that technology cuts across a number of other goals, and means of implementation aspects are reflected as well within the different goals that are presented in the current proposal of the post-2015 agenda. The synthesis report of the Secretary General that was introduced in the earlier presentation from Joaquin in paragraphs from 118 and 126 is again making a very strong reference to technology and suggesting some proposals of way forward, on one of which there is already action, and I'll revert to that later on during the presentation. So what did we see when we started looking around and trying to set the context on where we are today in terms of technology, technology needs being addressed, technology gaps being there or not? Let me just start by making one first comment. The research within literature actually brought up a lot of information on technologies in general, quite some information on energy technology. I need to say that it was slightly more challenging to find historical information and a good evidence of technology that would be pertinent specifically to the water technology dimension. Maybe that's a note we want to make for ourselves in terms of making sure that we strengthen access to information on an aspect which is extremely relevant for the discussion we're having in these days. The graphics that are microscale but are a little bit bigger in the background paper will show you very clearly that if there's technology being developed, this is normally happening in the developed country, and that the flow of technology is still from developed country to developing country. There's also information on patents being registered. In parallel to that, this flow is still generating a very uneven distribution and a very uneven capacity to respond to technology needs of developing country. Not tapped at all seem to be the dimension of technology innovation being built on the knowledge and the culture of developing countries and indigenous communities. So a number of issues that are starting to populate our landscape. So why are we discussing within that context the importance of technology, being it technology development, technology transfer, technology adaptation, technology dissemination? All those elements will be part of the constellation of the discussion that we will undertake. Well, again, when we go to literature, there's a clear association of technology with a number of positive concepts. Be it economic development, technology is perceived to be an important ingredient of the economic development. Environmental improvement, again, technology seems to be an important aspect to achieve environmental improvement as well as productivity in the use of natural resources or in the reduction of pressure onto national resources. Poverty alleviation, access to new market was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, more stringent requirements for products. And how is this achieved? Would technology be a solution to respond to that? Capital investment, there is, when technology are being implemented, there's a large collaboration of different partners that are coming along and that are mobilizing growing opportunities around the technology itself. Sustainable solutions. How can we come up with solutions that are not only the small patch being placed in a problem, but that see the problem in a more holistic perspective? So we started to group out the numerous challenges to technology implementation that were coming up from the research. On purpose, you will see empty boxes. We do not have the expectations to have found all of them. So we are looking very much forward to the discussion of these 2 days to be able to fill any eventual gap that we have identified during this process. We also tried to make a distinction between those two challenges, the group of challenges that were emerging from the discussion. We tried to figure out whether some of those challenges were actually challenges associated with other means of implementation, and we actually found quite a few of them would be resonating to access to finance, access to sustained finance to maintain technological solution, as well as the existence of incentives that are not prone to stimulating the implementation of new technological solutions. The absence or the weakness of the governance framework, which would hinder the implementation of technological solution. The absence of capacity, skills, knowledge, and understanding that would not only limit or hinder the identification of the technological solution, but its adaptation and its operation. The second set, which is not really a clear-cut set, but still there were some of them we wanted to retain in their discussion that are maybe less directly correlated to some of the issues that were raised in the earlier presentation, are again access to information, knowing which are the solutions in order to be able to select which one is the right one for me, making sure that there is awareness in the communities about some of those solutions, challenges related to water risks that are addressed through technological solution do open a lot of additional challenges that are related to cultural barriers, social awareness, and education of the community. Absorptive capacity, being those technological solutions part of a system which probably is not being designed to enable the implementation of this solution, and property rights associated to the technologies and the governance aspects associated with that. So let me quickly close the presentation by referring back to some of the homeworks that we would like to leave to the participants that will be discussing tomorrow in the session and the day after. As I was mentioning to you, the Secretary General report in some of the paragraph was calling specifically to some action that refers to technology, and more specifically calls for an effort to establish an online global platform building on and complementing existing initiative and with the participation of all stakeholders, being it the Global Technology Facilitation Platform. The open question I would like to leave to all of us is, would it make sense that the efforts that we're doing in the specific domain of technology in the course of this conference are actually feeding into that effort? Another presentation preceded me, but I'm really happy to reinforce the fact of having a unique voice throughout the different processes. It just echoes some of the intergovernmental processes that were described in the earlier presentations. How can the discussion that we are going to have in these 2 days set the basis for having a coherent voice throughout this process in the different subject matters that we're going to discuss today, and how can they be synergistic one to the other? Some of the processes are actually tackling upon challenges that we're facing. And let me conclude by touching upon the tools. We were asked, and I know Josefina will be very upset at me, to refer to specific tools that address some of the challenges. I really had a hard time picking among the tools that are listed in the paper, so I didn't do that, especially because you will listen about those tools tomorrow and the day after. But what will be important for us to reflect on while going through and analyzing those tools is to understand which are the challenges, and it's generally more than one that they helped us to address, which are the challenges that are outstanding. What was the role of this tool in doing that, so that these could help us frame a discussion into how can we scale up and replicate the effort that we have been doing so far. We started by saying responding to technology needs is a challenge that is still leaving patches around. It's completely uneven. So how can we build on the very good experience that is in this room to scale up the effort? And my last slide is just a reference to where you would find all information. There is unfortunately not in the slide, but I'm sure you will easily find on the same page the link to the toolbox. I'm please asking you to take time to go to the toolbox. That's a very nice instrument that has been put together. And I'm sure we have not also been able to capture all the tools that are out there. So your input would definitely be very welcome. Thank you.
So you can see we have very good presentations, different from what you would expect to start with. And but I think I just leave myself with the issue, and I think you mentioned it very briefly, but I think it's very important, the patents issue, the issue of who develops the technology and who uses it. And I think that that's very important. The issue also of the incentives, which technology is developed and which technology is used. So, maybe the OECD also will pick up on that, on the question of economic instruments. And also thank you for making this institutional link, which is so important with this technology platform that we are being asked by the Secretary General to develop. So thank you very much. So now we have all this information on the table about challenges for technology, governance tools, capacity development tools, economic instruments tools. And in the conference, you had this tools aspect, but you also have the themes. That we have grouped together some of the targets of the SDGs to create these themes. And we now have this response panel. They are going to tell us how these presentations, these tools, how they make sense in relation for the different themes that are being part of the SDGs and the targets proposals. So to do that, I'm going to ask my colleague from FAO, Jean-Marc Faures, to start. He was the lead organization for the water resources management, together with the Global Water Partnership. I think Ursula is here as well. So please, the floor is yours. What do you think about this? You will do it from there. There's not going to be presentations for this response panel, so go ahead.
I will. Okay, it works. So thank you, Josefina. And I guess the difference between a presentation and a panelist is that the panelist speaks while he's sitting. So indeed, as you said, we were together with GWP helping in the preparation of this conference, looking at the theme on water resource management and water scarcity. And therefore, I've been listening to the presentations and preparing a little bit for this discussion, having this water scarcity and water resource management focus in mind. I guess this is the rule of the game. You asked us to look at the challenges and new issues, and I thought, well, let's be a little bit optimistic also. It's the beginning of the year, a very important year. So I consider new issues also new opportunities. And although it has been very eloquently presented earlier this afternoon, I'd like to come back for a few minutes to this story of the SDG Goal on water. Because for us, dealing with water resource management in particular and with water scarcity, it is really an exceptional circumstances. For the first time, water goes beyond the targets that we all know for many years now of WASH on water supply and sanitation. And countries have accepted to look at water in a broader sense, including all the issues related to management, to scarcity, to pollution, etc. And I've been very jealous looking at the WASH people and their targets and reaching their targets. And I can tell you, this is going to be really a change for us. Because when country will have accepted to commit to agreed targets, it will be much easier for us working in that field to engage with all different stakeholders and partners and discuss these questions that so far have not had international goals or targets. I would like also to quickly make a parallel with Goal 2. Everybody knows Goal number 2, of course. This is about food security. And something very similar has happened to Goal 2. In the past, we were talking about eradicating hunger or reducing hunger. And now the goal is food security and sustainable agriculture, just like wash and water resource management. So I think it's really interesting to see how countries are taking the three letters SDG very seriously, and this is a very good signal. Very quickly also about the four presentations, excellent, very interesting, and I think a mind opener for the discussions. I pick a few points. For the first one, and I just said how water resource management didn't always find an easy linkage with WASH issues. I think we are seeing here how the border between water resource management, water scarcity, and WASH is coming clearer. We are seeing many people discussing issues of multiple uses, whether they come from water supply and see that water is being used beyond just drinking and domestic use for productive activities, and how we can deal with that. And we are also seeing that from the other side when, for instance, we see that an irrigation scheme has much more uses, and including domestic uses, that was earlier envisaged. So these issues of how we manage multiple use, I think it's very interesting. The second presentation on governance, I love governance, so I mean, I'm not very objective here. I thought it was great. I thought it gives a lot of good ground for thinking, and I would agree 100% on the question of policy coherence. This is okay, when you deal with water resource management, what you deal with is a series of sectors that all develop marvelous policies without thinking about the other sectors, and all the problems arise when you try to address that in terms of water management, water allocation, etc. So this cross-sectoral dimension, and I think a lot of progress has been made in the recent past to acknowledge that and to make these sectors real stakeholders in the discussion is going to be increasingly important. The third point on finance and economic instruments, of course, indeed, it is very controversial, very difficult. I read something that I liked very much, and I heard implementation issues. I think everything, all the issues are there, all the challenges are there. Okay, there are some good principles and good economic basis, but you have very serious implementation challenges, and maybe we will have opportunity to discuss that during these 2 days. And then in technology, I was really happy to hear that you had some problems finding major technology issues in water, because I was writing here, well, maybe it's outside water that technology change will have most impact on water. And you mentioned that after I wrote it, so I agree with you also. Typically in agriculture, whatever we can do in increasing productivity, efficiency in agriculture, obviously releases water for other users or for the environment. Imagine energy. I think this is really interesting to look at technology in relation with water beyond the water box, as we tend to say. And finally, to the groups of tomorrow, I have also homework. Very quickly also to business. I would like to hear how business sees its role, how it can promote responsible investment and management in water in conditions of scarcity, and also what are the critical enabling conditions for them to be able to do that. Issues of certification, voluntary guidelines, etc. I would be very interested to hear. To the civil society, this is such a broad group. I would like to hear from a gender perspective, from young people, how they see the water scarcity challenge, and in particular, what are the more critical issues dealing with water scarcity that affect them. But I also would like to look at also what we call responsible consumption. We have always, when we deal with sectors dealing with water, we look at the producers on energy side, on agriculture side, etc. But what about consumption? What is the role and the responsibility of those who consume the products that we produce? To the academia, I think there is a major issue still to be addressed, is bridging the knowledge gap between research and policy. And I've seen that in one presentation, and I think this is really a very interesting subject to discuss. And finally, to governments, we can discuss at length good governance, efficient governance, better governance, improved governance. I think the whole issue of the political difficulty of managing scarcity is very well known to us. It is an extremely difficult issue, but it has to be addressed. How do we manage scarcity? In the past, we would give more water to more people. Now we have to divide less water among even more people. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. You can see there is a lot of homework for you and a lot of issues on the table. And thank you very much, Jean-Marc, because you have really played the role of trying to bring the thematic issues into the discussion. So now we are going to have you're going to Nathalie, André, and Didier Allais from WHO. I'm not sure what you're going to talk, both of you, or you're going to...
I think I'll start. And then
I know you don't have it easy, because we already had a presentation from Jose on that. So
yes, we have discussed, so there is no overlap.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So like Jean-Marc, I'm thankful to be seated because I'm wearing some new shoes with very pointed hips, and it's not a good idea to be standing right now. José Gesti introduced saying that the MDG targets had been reached for water, we haven't reached them for sanitation. So progress has been made, but there's something that we'd like to kind of highlight again, which I think he mentioned, is that there are great disparities. So the disparities between countries, within the countries, between water and sanitation, between urban and rural areas, and between income groups. And I think that's been picked up by a lot of discussions now and also this morning.
So we have to see how the tools deal with disparities, no?
Yeah. And there's, as José mentioned, the UN resolution on the human rights to water and sanitation has been critical at bringing water and sanitation back onto the discussions, but also at highlighting issues that are not addressed in the MDGs, including availability, acceptability, quality, and safety. So WHO has a long history in monitoring, probably the monitoring and guidelines. So the monitoring reports, one of them is done in conjunction with UNICEF, the JMP reports. And there's one which I'd just like to hold up here, the GLASS report, which is mentioned in some of the documentation here. And I want to highlight it because I think it is extremely relevant to some of the discussions today and this afternoon by the people here. So it is the global analysis and assessment of sanitation and drinking water. It's a report that has an assessment of 94 countries. It comes out every 2 years. And I think that the difference maybe with this report is that it is a self-assessment by countries, but the countries are asked to hold various stakeholder meetings to come up with their assessment. So the actual process is nearly as important as the report itself. And it covers issues which were discussed by people here today. So the monitoring, financing, including tariffs, which was mentioned just now. And you can see the different status in the different countries where, for instance, Brazil has nearly 80% of their funding for water and sanitation being raised by tariffs, but other countries it's as low as 6%. So really, each country is very different, and I don't think there's a quick solution for all. So the key challenges, which I think WHO are working on and consider important, are the sanitation cycle. So I think that's something that hasn't really been talked up to now. It's not just about containment, it's also about the safe collection, treatment and disposal, and potential reuse of the waste. So that's one important thing we're working on with guidelines, with actual indicators. What are the indicators that should be monitored for this? Another one is access to safe water. which has been mentioned already. So the water safety plans are particularly important in small communities and in rural areas. And also the introduction of safe water in household surveys. So the household surveys do form the basis of the JMP numbers on estimates to access. And now what WHO is trying to do is include the aspect of safe water so that we can actually provide estimates to how many people have access to safe water, which is important. Another key challenge which we're working on is wash beyond households. So it's wash in schools, wash in healthcare facilities. There's a surprisingly low coverage of wash in schools and health facilities, and as the GLASS report mentions, it's still not being talked about in policies. So it's kind of surprising, but it's something we're working on as well. Then there's the hygiene, which I think has been mentioned also. That is something that GLASS touches upon as well, and I think it's something that needs to be worked on a lot. And lastly, financing and monitoring, and these are two areas which Didier has been working very closely on, so I'll hand over to him.
Yeah, thank you. About financing, we all agree, looking at the figures, that there is not enough funding in the sector. That's something that everybody agrees. Aziza mentioned that many countries have difficulties with their governance because there is insufficient funding or inadequate funding. But and also there is a big question, as you mentioned earlier. It's the division between the three T's. How much burden do you put on the users, or how much burden do you put on the taxpayers or the external aid? And as you mentioned, it's not one rule that you can apply everywhere. But the big difficulty is to get a good picture of that situation within the country. We noticed in the GLASS report that over 70% of the countries said that they need more funding in the sector. But when you look at the data that they sent, it's around half of them were able to communicate data on how much funding goes into the sector. And when you look at in details, it's very few that are able to communicate information on the three T's, which shows that it is very difficult to have a good picture of the financing of the sector. And this, for us, it's going to be very important to establish a system, a methodology that can be recognized by everybody, like it was done for the health sector, to know exactly what is the situation. It's very important to have that detailed picture, because then you know where the gaps are, and probably there are some parts where, especially since the sector has many actors, there are some areas of the sector that fall into the cracks. We're very often talking about peri-urban, and it's not the responsibility of anybody sometimes. So it's very important to go into that level of details. We've worked, we developed a methodology called TrackFin, tracking financing in the sector, that helps. But there are some other initiatives, and it's going to be very important. So that's something for tomorrow. It's to look at government level, what can be done to improve the monitoring of the finance of the sector. The last one is about monitoring. Everybody agrees that there is a need to strengthen monitoring, both at national and global level, especially considering that there are new areas to be monitored with the new indicators that are proposed, that are suggested for the post-2015. But it is important to take into account that those new areas, but also to make sure that the new generation of monitoring will be simple, understandable by countries. It's saying that it's easy, but it won't necessarily be easy to implement. But we need to keep in mind that it's adding a burden on the governments and we need to be realistic about this. We need to make sure that in this monitoring, we can make the link between the national monitoring and the global monitoring. We need to make sure that there is an alignment. Otherwise, and that was the case for GMP for a long time, there is a misunderstanding of the results from the national level with the global level and big fights. Well, when we go in details, we understand why there are differences. So look for comparability. And something that is very, very important that we were not doing very much at global level, it's to look at disparities. And I really think that with the rights, let's put an S now, to water and sanitation, I think it's going to be very, very important to go into details in looking at the disparities, to look at the questions of inequities or equities, and the different groups that we're covering. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And thank you for bringing the issue of monitoring. We try to avoid a little bit the monitoring issue in this conference because I think in itself it will require a whole conference. But I think, anyway, thank you because it is related and we put it in the issues of governance as well as you did. Okay, so now John Harding. So you're going to tell us about how all this makes sense for risks.
Thank you, Josefina. Thank you for the well-organized meeting too, and the friendly welcome. As you can imagine, since I work in the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNISDR, I was very happy to see that the issue of disaster risk management was the main thread throughout this event, the end of decade event. It's never very difficult to make the case for this topic. You can see the situation evolving at the moment in Malawi. After the heavy rains this weekend, we have a UN team heading down there as we speak, trying to help the country try and assess the impact of the disaster. But the situation is pretty worrying, and we're expecting more rains, and it's certainly going to impact the efforts of Malawi to achieve any kind of target or goals they have on water sanitation or other water objectives. It's also a topical subject at the moment because, as previous speakers referred to, as we speak now, member states are discussing the future framework for disaster risk reduction in Geneva. When I left last night at 2 o'clock, they were converging for the first time on 7 global targets on disaster risk management. And this is will be the first time we actually have such targets in the context of an international framework. And member states are listening to the kind of recommendations that were made in the previous panels, because they're making sure these are very much aligned with the SDGs, and they'll also be carrying the same discussions through to the Paris Conference of the Parties when they may discuss a target on climate change adaptation. So it's quite encouraging to see those types of discussions taking place. Josefina asked me to identify 1 or 2 challenges that come out of our engagement with countries on this topic that could help drive the discussions over the next 2 days within your different sector groups. Before I mention one or 2 of these challenges, I just want to just reiterate, what are we really talking about here when we're talking about disaster risk management in the context of water? Because there's been quite a strong evolution of the topic and this subject in this area of work. And if you go back 15 years or even 10 years ago when the decade started, we talked mainly about floods and droughts when you're talking about water-related disasters. And when we were talking about policies to address them, we would say we have structural approaches or non-structural approaches. And we were quite strong on the structural approaches, and we never really understood what the non-structural things were about, all these stuff, soft policies, insurance, and other things. We've come a long way now since that, and today, if we're talking about risk management in the context of water work, there's a much broader perspective of what risk actually means. We're looking at risks to hazards, to technological, natural hazards, economic shocks, and so on. And if we have colleagues from OECD here, so I'll use some of their language. And we don't usually use it much in the context of our frameworks. But countries are also looking at malicious risk. I refer to some of the non-malicious risk, but malicious risk, which are risks such as war and terrorism. So a much broader spectrum and approach to these types of issues, and we have to take this into consideration. Another aspect of when you're talking about these kind of topics, you're going to hear many terms used. There are already many terms even within this panel. We talk about climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, resilience. Don't let this distract you. I can tell you, in Malawi, it's floods. And the policies they're putting in place, they're looking at the type of crops they can use. It's about the way they build their roads, their bridges. I mean, when we come in, they'll adapt to whatever language we use, but the principles underlying all these issues are the same. So just focus on these and don't get too distracted by these types of terms and definitions. So let me identify maybe two big challenges that can drive the discussions over the next 2 days. One is this, and this comes out from our engagement with countries and when we monitor the efforts that countries are doing to implement these frameworks, such as the Hyogo Framework for Action and other global agendas. One is this need to shift the perception that somehow disaster risk management is an externality to our decisions that we make, our development decisions and planning decisions, including in the water, investment decisions related to water. Now, we really have to make sure that we have to be well aware that risk will either be increased or reduced through investment decisions that we make every day. And this includes investment decisions related to water and sanitation and access to water and so on. And I insist these investments are both public and private investments. And that's why it's very relevant that there's going to be discussions with the private sector here in this context. Every country that I've worked in, typically, if you look at the overall economic turnover, I'm going into a risky area here because I have colleagues from OECD and I'm going into economics, but if you look at the overall economic turnover, typically it would be between 25 and 28% would be public investments, and the rest would be private investments. So a lot of the roads that have been built, the buildings, even natural resource management are coming through private investments, and so we really need to influence those types of investment decisions if we're going to be successful in reducing risk in any way in the future. So really, DRM intrinsic to decisions, and it's intrinsic decisions related to water. So DRM is not a goal in itself. Access to water is a goal. DRM is a principle that can help us achieve that objective. The second, if I still have time, the second big objective that I wanted to relate to is around the discussion on tools. What we're seeing is that there's been tremendous progress over the last 10 years in putting in place the policies, the strategies to manage risk. There's a very strong level of commitment. It's national authorities, it's in local and cities, the mayors, they're all very aware of this issue. When you sit where I am, you always think it's because of our conferences and the advocacy we do. Of course, the reality is simply because the impact of disasters are such on the economies of these countries that they're having to put in place these kind of strategies and even legislative frameworks. They're quite advanced. However, they're extremely challenged in having to make decisions when they have a broad spectrum of policy options on how to actually reduce risk, including when we're dealing with water risk. So they have to decide on long-term planning issues. Are we going to relocate populations? Are we going to invest in upstream forest management and ecosystem management that's going to reduce the impact of floods? Are we going to invest in infrastructure, the water reserve infrastructure, or are we going to put shorter-term policies in place? Seasonal forecast, choice of crops, early warning, preparedness. They're having to choose between all these policy options, and it's extremely challenging for them. And they need the tools that are going to help them make these decisions and include it into their economic forecasts. And I'd like to say it's not just economic cost benefit that are required. It relates to social, environmental, also dimensions. So it's looking at the whole spectrum of efficiency. It's the efficiency of different decisions as they're moving forward and looking at these type of issues. And of course, they're also going to have to pick up the pieces. There are always going to be extreme climate events and disasters. and they're going to have to deal with these residual risks, so they have to look at offsetting those risks through insurance schemes, catastrophic loss mechanisms that were referred to by some of our colleagues. There's some interesting models out there that we can refer to over the next few days. So just, I mean, as you can see, I hope I made the case that it's a very relevant topic for all the stakeholder discussions during the week, private sector, the governance, the civil society, the academics. There's going to be requirements from all of them. No homework from me. I've got 2 adolescent daughters. I know how they feel about that. But maybe if I could just finish with one figure, just to give you an idea of the scale of what we're talking about here. We've just, in the context of this World Conference that's coming up in Japan, in Sendai, that was referred to by a number of colleagues before, we've looked at, in the context of the risk, to 4 hazards. So we looked at tsunami risk, flood risk, cyclones, and a 4th one, I can't recall. No, drought, we don't have data on drought, unfortunately, and that's because countries don't measure the impacts of drought on their economies. So we don't have, unfortunately, that information, and we need that information. But if we look at it and we look at the annual average loss due to those 4 hazards, the total is 314 billion. So 314 billion is how much countries are going to have to put aside if they simply want to continue their current development pathway, including in the area of water. So that's the scale of investment that's going to be required in addressing this. And these investments within, it has to be within our current, our existing development efforts. And if you see Malawi yesterday, the Minister of Finance, he released $1 million just to deal with the first 2 days of the crisis. This is not coming from some humanitarian fund that we set up here in the UN. It comes from public money that will not be available to build water and sanitation investments in Malawi in the coming years. So I'll finish here, Josefina. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to comment because there is so many things that I would like to. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure everybody is taking it as food for thought. And last but not least, I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Thomas Chiramba, who is going to talk about water quality challenges and ecosystem protection. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Josefina. What I will do, I will comment on the presentations, which indeed were very, very good and very insightful. And I hope they stimulated the participants to think through some of the issues raised. But I'll also go through some of the questions that you asked us about our views on what we've heard today, and also generally what is in the documents that we've had. That would help focus the discussions of the participants in the next few days. That's what I'll do. Now, the first one is certainly, like I said, the presentations were excellent. They were excellent because with respect to water quality and ecosystems, Josefina, I think the presentations on the governance issues, presentation on the funding, and on the technology were all very relevant. Why? Because the issue of water quality has been neglected not only by outside stakeholders, at the various levels outside the water sector, but even within the water sector, we are focused over the years on water quantity. Now, the big challenge is it's a neglected area, and it has therefore not been prioritized, and therefore it faces a lot of challenges in all those 3 areas. So the solutions that were presented today would be very, very useful, and I would encourage the participants to look at them more closely. But also, linked to the issue of this area having been neglected, there's one fundamental issue that we face here that we need to deal with regards to implementation of the target within of this theme. The fact that we know too little about the water quality, about what is the state of water quality, first and foremost, but even less about what is its impact on the aquatic ecosystems. We know far too little. And that's, of course, a very challenging position to start off implementing something. It's very difficult to implement something that you don't quite understand to what extent, what are the trends, and how fast you are reversing that. So that's going to be one of the big implementation challenges, that we need to know more about it as soon as possible within a context that with very little data, and both in terms of spatially, but also in terms of content parameters, and also we have and its linkages to other sectors, but also within the background of governments not willing to share that data. That's a big challenge that we need to deal with, and also with governments not sharing, with very little opportunities of exchanging information on effective policies, approaches, and so on. That's the background we have here. And with stakeholders not having been sensitized to a level that they play an important role in addressing the water quality challenge. That deals with what are the related issues that I see in terms of implementation of that. Moving on to the next one, which was in the issue of implementation and what are the new or more difficult issues to deal with. Certainly here, you will see issues related to governance that were raised today. They all apply here in terms of insufficient frameworks, institutional arrangements that are inadequate, enforcement. All those things apply to water quality. Those are the issues we need to deal with. But also, there are also some exciting things within this, this target that we have that up to now has not been talked about very loudly, because we are people coming from the water sector. Here I want to raise the issue that in this target that we got from the Open Working Group, it includes issues like, it's of course reducing pollution that we understood very well and we started working on it, but eliminating dumping and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and materials. That we've not come into to grips with that, but certainly it's there because government have prioritized it and we need to think about it. It also challenges us to look at how do we link with other colleagues outside the water sector, the chemicals guys. How do we link? I heard about climate change here. It's closely linked to also to water quality. So that those challenges, that those issues that we have to think through on how we deal with. Exciting things that are here that I see that we could be working more on, and I'm very happy that they're in the target and we see how we're going to deal with them. We have been paying lip service to water efficiency. And I think water efficiency and water quality are closely linked. And I hope this time that agenda will be pushed. But also there are other elements like wastewater treatment and also issues related to wastewater reuse and resources within wastewater. And I think turning wastewater into a resource, those are exciting times. But how do we go about it, and how do we deal with issues of acceptability? Those are issues where we expect to use a lot of the tools that were talked about to deal with such issues. I want to move on to the issue of tools. Indeed, there are quite a number of tools. Even in UNEP, we do have a number of tools. We have GEMS water, we have the World Water Quality Assessment that we are doing with UN Water, and several other tools that we are developing and publications we have released. But the question that is always there is the issue of, are they fit for use? Are they fit for the purpose we want them to deliver on the SDGs? That's something that I really would like the participants to think about, and I think my colleague has given a few ideas on how to deal with that, to look at the tools that are available, but more importantly, how do we adjust them so that they help us to achieve the MDGs. Now, with regards to my expectations for the next 2 days, the first one is certainly the issue of getting to know what countries and other stakeholders are doing in terms of addressing the water quality challenge. There are many things that are happening out there. We know too little about it. Like I mentioned, we have not shared enough on that. So I'm hoping that through this conference, through this meeting here, we'll be able to know more about those and think more importantly about how do we upscale those approaches that have been found to be working well and would help us achieve the goals quicker. The next one would be, of course, I'm sure participants also know too little about what the UN does. The UN Water, even UN Water does. We have the what do you call it, Jens? The UN Water Activity Information System, which shows what we do. But I don't know how many participants know. We need to share more about what we are doing also as UN agencies with participants and beyond. So I expect that those discussions also to take place. Finally, or the fourth point is I would really want to know what recommendations and incentives participants here have to countries that would encourage countries to invest more in monitoring water quality so that we know what it's all about, and also to share data, but more importantly, to share even their institutional arrangements, instruments that they've developed that are working. So I hope to get some ideas on that. And finally, I know you said we shouldn't talk about it, about monitoring. Yes, within UN Water, we're developing we have this global expanded monitoring initiative. Yes, of course, all the proposals we come up with, if we don't really deal with the issue of means of implementations, what it means to governments, then I don't think we'll be able to help our negotiators very well, and we'll be able to defend the SDG as it is. And indeed, I think it's very important for water quality. That's what I expect, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thomas, we have to monitor means of implementation as well. Is that what I heard from you?
We have to discuss that here.
Okay, okay. Great. You know, I'm tempted to give my tool coordinators the word, but I'm not going to do it because it's a little bit late. The purpose, and I'm not going to give you the floor either, because the purpose of this presentation was really to set the scene, and everything you want to know, everything you want to discuss, it will be done tomorrow. Tomorrow is your day, and it's the time that you're going to discuss and deal with all the issues that have been presented here. And it's late, and it's coffee break, and I know I put off the coffee break for a long time, so just have your coffee and come back in half an hour. Thank you very much. And a big round of applause to our speakers.